This book was never banned, it was quietly buried. Not because it lacked value, but because it revealed too much. It didn't preach faith or mysticism, it delivered the method, a system for reprogramming reality through intention, vibration, and mental focus. Most saw symbols, a few saw instructions. It taught how to influence thought, alter behavior, and project silent commands. What looked like esoteric philosophy was, in fact, a tactical manual. And while it was dismissed as spiritual fiction, intelligence agencies were testing the same techniques behind closed doors. Now it's back. No intermediaries, no filters. Just you, the knowledge, and whatever you choose to do with it.
In the dusty archives of esoteric libraries, lost among poorly understood alchemical treatises and spiritualist pamphlets of questionable taste, there circulates mention of a certain manuscript, a book whose very existence is almost an anomaly. It has no commercial aura, isn't cited at mystic conferences, nor does it appear in the catalogues of the great initiatic orders. Almost no one reads it, and even fewer discuss it, and some say that's exactly how it should be. What makes this book so undesirable? Unlike classic grimoires, such as the Clavicular Salomonis or the codified volumes of Theosophy, this work doesn't flaunt threats or ritualistic enchantments. Its language is technical, direct, and almost clinical. But what it reveals, or rather, what it implies, calls into question everything we thought we knew about consciousness, reality, and the mind's role in designing the universe. Most seekers pass by it without knowing. It's there, camouflaged under a deliberately harmless title, The Secret Doctrine of the Rosicrucians. It was published in 1918 by an anonymous author, or rather, under the pseudonym Magus Incognito, an expression that already carries within it the first layer of the enigma, the hidden Magus. No precise dates, no biography, no trail. For decades, this book didn't gain any spotlight, and the curious thing is that even among occultism scholars, few seem to have actually read it. The few who have, and who dared to comment, claim that its content isn't just esoteric, but dangerous. Not because of the form, but because of the power contained in the information, between the lines. Even before the advent of quantum physics, or the popularization of ideas that the universe is shaped by fields of consciousness, this book already spoke of thought forms capable of altering the substance of reality, mental flames that rekindle subtle planes of being, and invisible energetic structures that sustain the visible cosmos. Topics that would only gain scientific credibility almost a century later. The work proposes a cosmic understanding system that divides existence into 7 planes of consciousness. But it doesn't do so in a metaphorical or symbolic tone. It does so with mathematical, almost scientific precision. It points out that every manifest form arises from an unmanifest source, something the ancients called the Eternal Father, a presence asleep in a state of absolute potential. In its words, before light, there was the silent fire. Before time, there was only being without action. The manuscript walks through ideas with boldness. It affirms that the mind is a forgotten natural technology, capable of accessing and transmuting the universe's field of possibilities. But this mind only reveals itself to those who transcend the limits of the common self. The author implies that the ancient Rosicrucian masters never desired these truths to be opened to the profane world, and that this book, or the knowledge contained in it, leaked out. But why, after all, hide something like this? The explanation perhaps lies in what the text itself lets slip with subtlety. Magus Incognito warns that the power of mental creation, if activated without internal mastery, transforms into a tool of self-destruction. He doesn't speak of spells, he speaks of focus, attention, and will. In a particularly enigmatic passage, he says, "Thoughts shape the ether, and the ether is the fabric from which matter is born." Reality is a mental mirror. Masters don't create miracles, they just think with more clarity. Implicitly, the book articulates a bold thesis. Reality, as we know, it is a collective mental projection, structured by universal archetypes and modulated by the vibrations of each individual mind. This he calls mental alchemy, an occult technique transmitted orally for centuries and sealed among invisible orders until, inadvertently or not, it was compiled in this volume. And here lies the paradox. How did such disruptive content end up in a book printed in the USA at the beginning of the 20th century? How did it survive intact through time, censorship, and the dilution of ancestral wisdom? The most plausible hypothesis is what the author himself suggests, disguised between the lines. Knowledge only reveals itself to those who are ready to perceive it. The others simply cannot access it, even if they have it before their eyes. The book, then, functions as a kind of mirror. It adapts to the reader. For the inattentive, it sounds like just another occultist work among many. For the initiated, it becomes a map, a code, a silent initiation. And it's at this point that the work becomes most dangerous, because it doesn't impose dogmas, doesn't require masters, doesn't demand temples. It teaches the reader to become their own alchemist. And that, at any time, is subversive. If you've made it this far, perhaps something in you has recognized this ancient call. And if the real history of this book is unknown, it's because its function wasn't to be celebrated. It was to be discovered by those who were ready to remember. And perhaps, just perhaps, that moment has arrived. In certain discrete circles of modern occultism, there's a maxim that's never spoken aloud, but permeates all actions. What gives power isn't what you know, but what you keep silent. Perhaps that's why certain doctrines have never been officially taught, although they were meticulously documented, hidden in plain sight under layers of symbolism and silence. Among the most revealing manuscripts that escaped from ritualistic obscurity to almost technical language, few are as bold as the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians. The work, as we've seen, seems to have emerged before its time, and perhaps that's why it was buried in history's own chronology. However, it's in its intermediate pages that the veil really tears, revealing not just an ancestral metaphysics, but a hidden operating system of the universe, something closer to a vibrational warfare manual than a spiritual treatise. Far from devotional abstractions, the teachings presented there turn to practical and repetitive instructions, as if the author wanted the reader to memorize them until they became automatic. He teaches how to create coded mental forms, psychic constructions projected by the concentrated mind, loaded with intention, and projected with surgical precision onto reality's energetic field. Today, we call this creative visualization, neurolinguistic programming, or quantum modeling. But Magus Incognito was already talking about this over 100 years ago, with disconcerting clarity. The difference? Back then, these teachings weren't sold at motivational lectures, but transmitted within initiatic societies that demanded proof of character, absolute silence, and rigorous mental preparation. Among the most disturbing passages are specific instructions on how to direct mental energy currents to influence others' behaviors, not through verbal persuasion, but through silent vibrational emission. According to the author, ideas can be planted in other minds the same way seeds fall on soil, through proximity, repetition, and concentrated intention. These ideas echo what we now understand as subliminal suggestion, cognitive priming, or even consent engineering. But the book doesn't treat these concepts as discoveries. It presents them as already ancient techniques, as if they were tools of an invisible elite that always knew and applied them selectively to shape collective behavior. The textual structure reinforces this impression. Instead of philosophical reflections or parables, the author uses command language, as in military manuals. Terms like vibrational reprogramming, subtle transmission of mental images, dominion of the collective psychic field appear frequently, almost as if they were parts of a mental training reserved only for those who know how to use, not just understand. But there's a detail that catches the eye. The work insists, repeatedly, that such practices must be kept secret. Silence is power. The ignorant won't know how to discern and will destroy what they poorly understand. The key can only be delivered to those who recognize the lock. These are statements that appear disguised throughout the text as veiled warnings, reinforcing that this isn't content for just anyone. The question imposes itself: why so much zeal for secrecy? If these practices really offer tools to alter personal and collective reality, why hide them? The most likely answer isn't in mysticism, but in the subtle politics of power. For whoever dominates the vibrational field of the human psyche, that which acts below the level of conscious reason, no longer needs armies or courts. They influence without being perceived, decide without anyone realizing there was a choice. And what the book reveals, in its essence, is a hidden technology of mental influence, something that camouflaged itself under the guise of esoteric philosophy, while operating as an instrument of behavioral engineering. Today, when neuroscientists and unconscious psychologists finally begin to study how repetitive mental patterns can influence hormonal states, purchasing decisions, and political beliefs, what we see is just the reemergence, in modern language, of techniques that were already described in different clothing in this forgotten text. And there's another, even more disconcerting detail. The book's content, over the century, was quietly pushed into the domains of spiritual folklore. Labels like pseudoscience, romantic esotericism, or metaphysical fantasy were stuck on this knowledge with institutional zeal, as if it were necessary to discredit the tool so that no one would dare wield it. Because apparently, while this knowledge was publicly ridiculed, it continued being applied discreetly by the right hands, in advertising, in propaganda, in politics, not to liberate consciousness, but to keep it asleep. Reverse vibrational programming, the author would say. The secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians, then, perhaps was never a book forgotten by chance. It may very well have been deliberately silenced, not for being harmless, but for being too practical, for teaching what should never be taught, that the mind is a weapon, and that whoever learns to use it can move the world without touching it. But if someone finds it, understands it, and practices it, perhaps the game will balance out again. Perhaps. Every conscious omission carries the weight of a choice, and when analyzing the silent fate of the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians, a question becomes inevitable. Why did a book with such disruptive potential disappear almost completely from the academic, cultural, and historical radar? It wasn't burned, it wasn't officially censored, it just vanished. And the most intriguing thing is how this disappearance happened without any fanfare. A subtle, meticulous, almost elegant disappearance. As if someone very influential had an interest in the work continuing to exist, but invisible. Unlike other esoteric works from the same period, like the Kybalion, which had its influence analyzed by modern thinkers, or the Secret Doctrine, which was the subject of theses and academic symposiums, Magus Incognito's book was never seriously investigated by any university, research center, or mainstream historian. It doesn't appear in compendiums, reference bibliographies, or official archives about Western occultism. It's as if it simply had no historical importance, or worse, as if it had never existed. But that doesn't correspond to reality. What the work presents systematically are mental models that anticipate, decades in advance, the principles that today underpin disciplines like bioenergetics, neuroplasticity, physics of subtle fields, and even techniques used in military protocols of unconventional warfare. And yet, it remains classified in editorial catalogues as spiritual fiction, folkloric esotericism, or pseudoscience. But is it really? Those who go through the work's pages without the filter of prejudice quickly realize they're not facing empty speculations or metaphorical narratives. The text brings precise mental diagrams, vibrational manipulation schemes, descriptions of thought's energetic structure, and emotional transmutation tables, all laid out with almost pedagogical objectivity. They're not dogmatic assertions, they're instructions. And that's exactly why its exclusion from institutional debate doesn't seem accidental. At decisive moments in history, what threatens the current model is rarely fought with fire. It's erased through denial. And the case of this book seems to perfectly illustrate this tactic. The erasure didn't occur through criticism, but through its absence. And as we know, nothing discredits an idea more than pretending it's not worthy of discussion. This pattern of selective silencing becomes even more evident when we observe the treatment given to works with similar but less dangerous content. The Kybalion, for example, also addresses mental and universal laws, but does so in a symbolic, allegorical way without delivering practical tools. The secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians goes further. It teaches how to operate with techniques, sequence, and almost scientific language. And there's the critical difference. Symbolism is harmless, a technique is not. And perhaps that explains why it was classified as pseudoscience and filed away in the limbo of discredit. The most surprising thing, however, is that the book's central ideas began to reappear, disguised in recent years, but under labels more palatable to the establishment. Modern neuroscience speaks of neuroplasticity and synaptic reconnection via visualization. Particle physics suggests that the observer influences the field. Researchers like Rupert Sheldrake explore morphic fields and collective mental patterns. And the military training manuals of the Stargate project, now declassified, describe techniques of remote perception and psychic programming that echo, point by point, what was already described in the pages of that forgotten book from 1918. In other words, the content was repurposed, but with different packaging under control. What hides behind the absence of citations, the lack of academic studies, and editorial marginalization isn't irrelevance. It's institutional risk, a risk to the mechanistic logic that sustains the pillars of modern science, to the materialist paradigm that structures our universities, and, above all, to the monopoly that certain institutions hold over the knowledge of how reality is shaped. And here, perhaps, lies the clearest clue. When something is ignored by all official channels, but its ideas resurface in the hands of the strategic elite, it's no longer about negligence. It's about deliberate suppression. This book wasn't forgotten because it was harmless. It was silenced because it's functional, because it reveals something that should never have been opened, because it allows any awakened mind to understand the mechanisms by which it's constantly influenced, and perhaps, if they know how to apply what's there, to free themselves. But true freedom, as we know, isn't something the system distributes. It's something that's rediscovered. And for that, sometimes, you just need to find the right book, even if it's been buried where no one should look. Until now, the trail was one of silence, a well-orchestrated, systematic, and almost elegant erasure. But all it took was one loose thread in the veil for everything to begin revealing itself, and it was precisely in the name that almost no one mentions. The Secret Doctrine of the Rosicrucians, published in 1918 under the deliberately generic pseudonym Magus Incognito. A harmless title, an anonymous author. But behind the curtain was William Walker Atkinson, lawyer, editor, occultist, and one of the most discreet intellectual architects of 20th century American esotericism. Atkinson is known for having written dozens of books under multiple pseudonyms like Yogi Ramacharaka and Theron Q. Dumont. But this one is different. It's not a spiritual work in the devotional sense. It's an artifact, a camouflaged device. The secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians presents itself as an introductory treatise on Rosicrucian philosophy, but delivers much more than mystical symbolism or metaphysical speculations. Read carefully, or more precisely with the inner eye activated, the work reveals operational protocols of psychic control, practical instructions for vibrational induction, and techniques for mental field expansion. It's literally a psychic warfare manual disguised as initiatic philosophy. One of its central premises is the use of the human mind as a frequency transmitter, capable of modulating the surrounding reality through mental images, symbolic codes, and conscious vibratory patterns. The so-called thought forms, described naturally throughout the book, aren't addressed as allegorical concepts, but as functional mechanisms, step-by-step instructions to project intention, manipulate energetic response, and restructure material circumstances. At a time when science was still crawling in, understanding the collective unconscious, Atkinson was already speaking, without beating around the bush, about how to plant ideas in other minds through concentrated vibration, something that today would be easily associated with concepts like neurological priming, limbic resonance, or subliminal pattern transmission. More than a theory, he delivers an operational doctrine. And surprisingly, the book circulated without resistance. The first editions were discreetly published by independent publishers, without marketing campaigns, without scandals or religious censorship. The reason? Simple: nobody paid attention. At first reading, the text seemed like just another esoteric compendium among many. But to the eyes of those who understand Hermeticism, energetic neuroscience, and the foundations of ceremonial magic, each chapter reveals itself as a coded protocol, a mental technology embedded under layers of symbolism. It's as if Atkinson, knowing well the risks of transmitting this type of knowledge openly, had opted for an invisible dissemination model, writing for those who know how to read with another mind. Several clues reinforce this thesis. The book systematically uses diagrams, tables, and creation aphorisms that, at first glance, may seem poetic or symbolic. But with the correct frame of reference, especially from Eastern traditions and modern systems of energetic psychology, these structures reveal themselves as true mental maps for reorganizing perception and modeling reality. We're talking about techniques that, a century later, would be rediscovered in military neuroconditioning projects, secret remote perception protocols, and studies on morphic fields of consciousness. The question that arises is inevitable. Why did Atkinson decide to hide this content within a Rosicrucian work? The answer may lie in the very nature of the information. At that time, any attempt to unite mind science, mysticism, and reality manipulation would be classified as heresy or delusion. Atkinson then followed an ingenious strategy. He wrote an advanced book as if it were basic and hid revolutionary tools under the disguise of esoteric tradition, an effective camouflage. For the common reader, it was just another mystical work. For the initiate, a key. More than preserving knowledge, the author seems to have desired to perpetuate it safely. After all, as an ancient Hermetic axiom said, the secret isn't in the hiding place, but in perception. He didn't write for everyone. He wrote for those who, upon reading what seemed symbolic, would realize it was literal. That thought forms aren't metaphors, but vibrational devices. That the mastery of the 7 planes isn't allegory, but the energetic structure of the human being. That the book, finally, wasn't a spiritual proposal. It was a tool so powerful it needed to be hidden within a harmless format, waiting, in silence, for the moment when prepared, minds could decode it. And apparently, that moment may have arrived. Because now, when rescuing this manuscript, we no longer read it with the eyes of 1918. We read it with the data of now, and we realize what it really is: an advanced vibrational programming manual hidden under the veils of tradition, written to resist time, and perhaps to survive any attempt to control human consciousness. Every control structure sustains itself on a simple principle: making the individual believe they have no power. That's why, when knowledge emerges affirming the opposite, and even teaches how to access this power, it becomes a threat, not just to the current system, but to the very architecture of social reality. The secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians does exactly that, and it's at this point that we understand why the work needed to be hidden. It doesn't teach belief, it teaches operation. The core of the Rosicrucian doctrine revealed by William Walker Atkinson doesn't revolve around blind faith, religious morality, or mystical ecstasy. Its focus is technical, direct, structured. We're facing a true treatise on consciousness engineering, and its proposal is clear. Reality isn't something you suffer, it's something you configure. At the heart of this doctrine rests a triad that, if properly understood and applied, transforms the individual into a vibrational operator: vibration, visualization, and symbolic repetition. These are the three axes on which, according to the book, all manifestation of reality is supported. Chapters like the etheric plane and its currents, or cosmic mentalism, don't beat around the bush. They describe with almost clinical precision how to use specific breathing techniques to activate what the author calls latent vital energy, how to maintain stable mental images to facilitate the materialization of events, and how to align personal intention fields with universal vibratory patterns, generating what today would be called reality resonance. And it doesn't stop there. Perhaps the most sensitive point, and the most disturbing, is in the section that teaches the reader to emit modulated mental waves, consciously charged, directed to influence other individuals' behavior. This part of the work describes what Atkinson calls silent astral bond, a psychic connection that can be established with another mind, without verbal contact, without conscious permission, and without leaving detectable traces. For the unprepared reader, all this would seem like fantasy or esoteric exaggeration, but someone familiar with indirect hypnosis, subliminal suggestion, morphic fields, or nonverbal communication protocols would understand what's being transmitted. These are advanced mental influence strategies, coded with hermetic language to go unnoticed. And that's exactly what makes this knowledge so sensitive and so dangerous. The work teaches, in essence, how to break the intermediaries between mind and world, how to reverse the game of external dependency, whether dogmatic religions, paternalistic governments, or social structures that promote passivity. The teaching is liberating, but at the same time explosive. If everyone knew how to operate this consciousness technology, the power pyramid that sustains the current system would simply collapse. That's why it was never taught at scale. Atkinson, aware of this potential, chose to encode this content. The work was made to be read as an enigma, a puzzle that only completes itself before a prepared mind. And for everyone else, just an esoteric curiosity, a pile of symbols and archaic expressions. But what's there is real, not as theory, but as practice. And it works. Breathing, image fixation, symbolic repetition, vibrational induction, intention projection, and psychic manipulation, all presented with a naturalness that only someone who truly mastered these operations could transmit. The most alarming thing, however, is realizing how these same concepts emerged later, masked, segmented, sanitized, in areas like coaching, behavioral psychology, mass marketing, and even classified military operations, but always with a crucial difference, without delivering the complete key. Fragmented, they became harmless. Only when understood together, as Atkinson taught them, do they reveal their true reach. And it's at this point that the conspiracy solidifies. The knowledge contained in this book wasn't forgotten out of disinterest. It was deliberately excluded from the public collection, not because it was false, but because it represents the exact opposite of the institutional logic of control. While modern culture repeats the mantra that everything is outside, this manuscript teaches that everything starts from within, and that the external world is just the moldable reflection of an awakened mind. That's the true heresy. And also perhaps the last frontier of freedom, because a mind trained to operate at this level no longer needs authority systems. It becomes sovereign, and internal sovereignty is the only revolution the system can never tolerate. Behind the scenes of esoteric history, silence can be as revealing as fanfare. And in the case of the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians, what draws attention isn't the absence of recognition, but the precision of forgetfulness. William Walker Atkinson, author of dozens of works under distinct pseudonyms, died without any public tribute, without debates about his legacy, and above all, without proper highlight to his most dangerous work. While names like Blavatsky, Crowley, and Rudolf Steiner were loved or hated, constantly debated, Atkinson was simply erased, but not by chance. Unlike his contemporaries who structured orders, hierarchies, and complex rituals to transmit knowledge, Atkinson dared to deliver knowledge without intermediaries. The secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians doesn't require formal initiation, submission to external symbols, or loyalty to organizations. Its proposal is direct and therefore subversive. The mind is the temple, the operator, and the altar. The spirituality proposed that doesn't bow before dogmas, priests, or authorities. It activates from inside out, and that's the biggest taboo of all. That's why his book represented a silent threat, not just to institutionalized religions, but also to the scientific political structures that, since the 19th century, began to frame the human being as a mere biological gear. Atkinson broke with this mechanistic vision. He proposed that consciousness wasn't a byproduct of the brain, but the organizing matrix of reality, and more, that it could be trained, amplified, and used to modify the physical, mental, and emotional world. This doctrine, if popularized, would undermine not only the foundations of religious traditions, but also the modern monopolies of knowledge, universities, laboratories, governments. By showing that the sacred is accessible without intermediaries, and that the creative power of reality is within each mind, Atkinson lit a fuse that the system could never allow to reach the masses. The result? A strategic forgetfulness. While his other works, disguised under exotic names like Yogi Ramacharaka, circulated freely as self-help literature or Eastern philosophy, the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians was removed from the center. It wasn't formally censored, but rather buried under layers of discredit, filed on obscure shelves, and reduced to the category of mystical curiosity. However, the ideas contained in it didn't disappear. They were just replicated, appropriated, repackaged, and used in very specific spheres. Decades after its publication, principles almost identical to those described by Atkinson began appearing in unexpected places. Declassified CIA files, like those from the Stargate project, revealed the use of remote viewing techniques, mental influence, consciousness state modulation, and reading distant events. Strategies that, in essence, were already described in 1918 with other names in the ignored pages of the book, Coincidence, or evidence that someone at some point understood exactly what was there and saw in it a strategic advantage? Atkinson wasn't talking about religion. He was talking about an operating system of consciousness capable of being executed by anyone willing to understand its principles. He wasn't selling faith, he was offering autonomy. And it's this autonomy that scares any structure based on collective submission. Today, in the midst of rising research on neuroplasticity, epigenetics, energy fields, and consciousness physics, the central concepts of the secret doctrine of the Rosicrucians are beginning to reappear, albeit timidly, in scientific congresses and specialized articles. There's talk about cardiac coherence, electromagnetic field of thought, influence of intention on matter. Researchers like Joe Dispenza, Bruce Lipton, and Greg Braden explore ideas that resonate deeply with what Atkinson had already coded. Yet, curiously, his name is almost never cited. The origin remains obscured, as if the system could accept the ideas, as long as it didn't reveal who formulated them first, as if the truth could circulate, as long as it didn't fully empower the individual, as long as the complete key wasn't delivered, as long as the operator remained dependent on modern techniques, specialists, paid courses, institutions. But the book wasn't written to be part of a market. It was written to survive time and repression. And it survived. Even today, its pages offer more than knowledge. They offer sovereignty. Not that built by dogmas or external validations, but the internal sovereignty of those who understand that the mind is a sacred tool, and that reality, far from being an immutable given, is a field moldable by frequency, image, and intention. School nor any institution. It depends only on a decision to awaken. Every transformation begins the instant you recognize that external reality isn't immutable, but rather a reflection of internal vibration, and this vibration can be elevated, modulated, refined. Every change begins with understanding your role as co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through conscious and structured meditation. That's why we've developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness and reprogram your reality from within. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on screen or in the comments. If this content resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me." This could be the first step on a path that was already written, just waiting to be remembered.